few people who have thought deeply, as deeply as you have, about the reasons why nations fail or regions prosper but others don't.
Our future depends on innovation. Right now, if large language models turn out to be half of what some of their boosters are claiming to be, then those who control them are going to have tremendous power over information and tremendous power all sorts of economic inputs. Most politicians and business leaders are asleep at the wheel. What's going on with artificial intelligence and how this will shape the international division of labor, the balance of power in the world, and control over information and data. Those are not questions that any of these politicians are asking. I think India has tremendous promise. India, Turkey, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, they should come together and they need to develop a voice in global affairs on the issue of technology.
So, on today's episode of the Great Tech Game podcast, I am absolutely honored to have, I can safely say, one of my favorite economists in the world and the author of at least two of my favorite books, Professor Daron Acemoglu, who's an economist at the Massachussetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and has most recently authored a book called Power and Progress, which we'll spend a lot of time on, but also another book which I've read and reread, Why Nations Fail. So it's a delight and an honor to have you with us, Professor Acemoglu.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
I've been waiting to have this conversation. I think there are few people who have thought deeply as you have, about the reasons why nations fail or regions prosper but others don't. And that's the question I want to get started with before we get to your more recent book, Power and Progress, where I think you make a different kind of argument as well. But for a second, if we can start off with your views on why or what causes certain nations to fail, others to not, and whether you've evolved your views since your earlier book came out, Why Nations Fail.
Of course, my views have evolved somewhat, but I'm still quite wedded to the main thesis of that book, that every nation, regardless of geography, religion, and history, has the capacity to succeed economically and socially. And the reason why many countries have failed to grasp these opportunities is institutions, meaning the way that they have chosen to organize their society, their politics, their economy. In particular, we have emphasized how many institutions around the world are shaped by elites, powerful groups that have disproportionate political power, and they have been designed in a way to look after their interests while impoverishing many other segments of society. The form of these institutional failures differs from society to society, but the commonality is the absence of secure property rights, good laws that provide equal access, equal opportunity, a level playing field, and state institutions that have the capacity to help the disadvantaged, protect the less powerful, and provide the types of laws and regulations that will contain the power of large companies and big players in the economy, because, quite frankly, it's clear even more today than ever in the last 30, 40 years, we live in a society in which we live in a world in which, some companies are going to get more powerful than others. They're going to get bigger than others. They're going to have bigger market size. They're going to be able to exploit network economies. They're going to get their support from government institutions. And we have to have the ability to contain their power. And that's the way that I see the more recent book, Power and Progress, co-written with Simon Johnson, to be intimately and closely related to the ideas of why nations fail, because we're still trying to grapple with the same issues of how to contain the power of powerful players, large firms, and visionary leaders. But now we are also talking about how this affects the direction of technology.
No, absolutely. And, I was recently speaking with, I think someone you know well as well, Professor Joel Mokyr. And and in our, again, wide-ranging conversation on this question of, why certain nations or societies prosper versus others don't, he ultimately distilled it down to one piece. And I want to get your views on that, because he also specifically asked me to ask you this. So his core distillation of all his work and decades of work on this came down to one piece. He said any society that encourages rebellion, that encourages people to question authority, that encourages people, incentivizes them almost to question the traditional ways of having done things. That to him was the key determinant of why certain nations or regions succeed and others don't, which is not necessarily in conflict with what you're saying.
Oh, not at
But of
all.
course,
I
one
completely agree
often
with
tends
that.
to think of institutions as, as behemoths that become behemoths themselves, and then by virtue of the bureaucracy of those institutions, become antithetical almost to the point that Professor Mokyr was making as the key determinant from his perspective.
No, I think Joel, who is one of the social scientists I respect most, is absolutely right. That sort of questioning, that sort of risk taking, both in the economic and the social sphere, is absolutely important. A rebelliousness is something we emphasize both in Power and Progress, and also in the second book that I wrote. Actually, it's the third book that I wrote with James Robinson, The Narrow Corridor. But I think we would put it slightly differently than Joel, and say that what you need is a balance between the capacity and power of state institutions and the ability of society to question and control these institutions. So the rebelliousness, risk-taking comes in the second leg, but that needs to be balanced with the power of the state as well, because I think predictability of laws is extremely important too. And if you have the one leg, meaning the sort of rebelliousness and the sort of questioning of authority, questioning of well-established truth, which is critical, but you don't have the order providing institutions, that is not going to be very conducive to economic activity either. So you need a balance between these two things.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. One of the, in my own book that came out last year called The Great Tech Game, one of the pieces that I argued was to understand what we are going through today. And I think I've seen that in your book in Power and Progress as well, is to rely and look back into history to see what kind of insights and lessons we can draw from earlier occasions where either technology or other shapers have really transformed society. Right. And one of the things that I concluded from looking back into history was the frame that I used was that I divided the past, at least the last 10,000 to 15,000 years of human history, into about five great games. I call the current game what we're living through the Great Tech Game, but I called the earlier great games like agriculture, trade, global trade, both land-based and oceanic, colonization, industrialization, capitalism, and then now technology, as these great games of our history, where certain shapers, whether it was agriculture, industrialization, and so on and so forth, transformed the geopolitics of the time, the geoeconomics of the time, shaped who won, who prospered, who didn't. And one of the conclusions I drew from there was that while we tend to look into history to see capabilities that will apply or will determine a nation's ability to win, my sense was that those capabilities change depending on the era that you're living in. So we can never say that the capabilities required in, let's say, the industrial era, in the beginning of the industrial era, would be similar to the ones you might require today, where technology seems to be the great engine of economic growth, right? And so I wanted to get your views on that. Besides the choices question, which we'll get to, and which you emphasize so much in the Power and Progress book, what kind of capabilities do you feel have changed in terms of the capabilities required to win or to prosper today versus in history?
Well, I there's much I like in your thesis, because one of the things we stress in Power and Progress is that technological transitions, moments in which new technologies that are going to have applications in a variety of sectors, in a variety of different ways, those transitional moments have a lot of choice, contingency, and require a lot of adaptation. This was so for the transition to agriculture and settled life from the world of hunter-gatherers and mobile societies. It was the same when from the early agricultural societies, there was a bigger transition to, big empires and states. It was the same when, post-Roman world got formed. It was definitely so when the commercial revolution happened and when the industrial revolution happened, when the second industrial revolution happened. All of these were great moments of adaptation, and the choices that were made during that period were critically important. And also the need to think of the general evolution of societies in a dynamic manner. That was one of the main themes of the narrow corridor, where we define the balance between state and society, which I mentioned briefly a second ago, as a never-ending dynamic rat race type of thing. That's why we coined the same term as in Alice in Wonderland, the Red Queen effect, meaning that both states and society, groups within society that are disorganized, sometimes more organized, they have to continuously change in order to keep up with the changing circumstances and the power balance between them. So very much the same thing. And I think that's so obvious today when we are grappling with, for example, how we have to change our laws, regulations, and contain different powers that have emerged in the process in the age of generative AI.
Absolutely, and are the capabilities going to be that will be required different as well? So, obviously there's the policy piece, right, and the policy especially around choice of technologies and all of that. But are the capabilities changing, or are we ultimately still relying on human innovation and, as you mentioned, the power of ideas? Or
Yeah,
is
I
it
think
that
I think those are
capital?
common. I don't doubt that institutions, state capacity, human creativity, human adaptability are going to be keys in the 21st century as they were in the 20th or the 19th century. But if you look at more micro level, yes, obviously, the types of skills that were so important in the 20th century are going to become less important. Because generative AI can become a complement in terms of information acquisition, processing, retrieval for agents. It can play some of the same roles that informed agents who emerged as hubs in social networks used to play. The type of physical manual work coordinated with mental activity that has become less important already in the age of industrial robots, and that's part of the reason why skilled blue-collar work has become less valuable, or semi-skilled blue-collar work has become less valuable over the last 35 years. So there will be transitions in terms of what sorts of skills are valued in the labor market, but I remain completely convinced on the basis of my broader understanding of history as well as the technology of artificial intelligence, that human creativity and human flexibility ought to remain central. That doesn't mean that it will, because there is a hype right now about how machines are better than humans, and they can inadvisably and incorrectly sideline humans to the detriment of society and business organizations in general.
Yeah, and I think your book is very clearly, one of the frames I try and use in conversations with people is to ask them to think about where on the spectrum of techno-optimism on one side and techno-pessimism on the other they lie, right? And I think in your book, clearly one of the pieces that you're arguing is that extreme forms of techno-optimism, which are often found amongst, one can argue, in places like Silicon Valley, in Bangalore, and in entrepreneurs and tech venture capitalists, the circle I often spend a lot of time in. I think your argument is to temper that,
Absolutely,
right?
it's a
To
counterweight
temper
to
that
that, but I wouldn't
techno-optimism.
have bothered to do that if it were to be found only in Silicon Valley and Bangalore. I think it is to be found in academia, it is to be found in journalism today, it is to be found in the Washington, D.C. Look, I think in the United States, you can say anything, but the hardest thing to get heard is when you start questioning tech. All of the major newspapers are so enamored with the tech sector that even when they criticize, this aspect of Facebook or that aspect of Elon Musk, they still try to elevate them to the extent possible. So the US has become really a techno-obsessed country in some sense. And don't get me wrong, I think, like you, I am very convinced that our future depends on innovation. I cannot imagine a happy, healthy, prosperous future for humanity that does not leverage our technological ingenuity. But that doesn't mean worshiping at the altar of new technologies, regardless of what they do. I
Absolutely.
give the example of the advances in chemical engineering, such as the Haber-Bosch process at the beginning of the 20th century. It is one of the most important breakthroughs that we've had in terms of, for example, feeding the world through artificial fertilizers, but it was also the method for building much more powerful explosives that hundreds of thousands of people. There isn't a necessity that every technological ingenuity is going to be used for good. There are some technologies that need to be regulated, and we have also a very, very important societal responsibility of choosing the direction of technological use and direction of technological development.
No, absolutely. I want to quickly quote a little piece of my conclusion to you. And it's almost the first question you tackle in your book, What is Progress? The chapter that talks about what is progress, because I think that's at the core of what you were just saying as well. So I say, and this is literally, I think, one of the last pages of my book, I say that the focus of technology, we should not view technology within a narrow paradigm of progress. The focus of technology must not be confined to the economic, political, and environmental models propagated by the trade, industrialist, or capitalist eras. Rather, we must view technology in the context of societal progress and a healthier, sustainable future for humans. Only then will technological progress start to equate with societal and human progress, right? And I think as I was reading your book, it seems to me that in part you're starting with the same assumption. What I conclude, I think that's your starting assumption, that technological progress cannot and will not equate societal or human progress.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's part of the reason why this is so difficult for both economists and the general policy experts in the United States, because it involves holding two potentially conflicting ideas in your head at the same time. On the one hand, economists, economic historians, people in the policy world recognize correctly that we are so fortunate today. We are so much more prosperous, so much healthier, so much more comfortable today because of technological advances over the last 300 years. Correct. Hell, even 50 years ago, things were much harder for most people in the West in terms of health access, in terms of comfort, and technologies have also facilitated that. But that has to be held at the same time as the fact that there was nothing automatic about any of these advances, that technological ingenuities could have been used for something much more nefarious. During other historical periods, they were, and there wasn't an ultimate inexorable progress that will always take us towards better outcomes after these technologies are introduced. Many of their harm may be irreversible. So it is these two conflicting ideas that then lead to the key conclusion of the book, which is that we have to find just the right institutions and the just right direction of technology to take advantage of this great moment. Another potential transition, or another game, as you've called it, which is the generative AI age. But we are likely to stumble into something quite bad if we don't create the new institutions to rein in those who have monopoly over data, huge power over people, huge ability to automate work and install more surveillance. I think there are tremendous imbalances that are emerging in the midst of our great opportunity.
No, absolutely. And I want to ask you about that. I want to ask you about the divergence, not just within nations, but also among nations. But before I get into that, I want to ask you, is this kind of techno-optimism that you're seeing in the US, are you seeing that across the world? Because my sense is
not
that
to the
other
same
countries
extent.
are unfortunately on the other side of the spectrum, and they'll suffer.
Sometimes I would say they are on the other side, but many times they are also followers. I think And I can see that from the reception that the book has gotten in the UK and the US. I think people are much more reasonable in terms of their understanding of technology, the opportunities and the dangers in the UK. But on the other hand, you see pressures from politicians and some businesses to be more like the US. Let's not worry about any of the guardrails, and let's now use this moment where we have freed ourselves from the European Union to jump all into AI without questioning it. I see that in the UK as well. So in some sense, where the US leads there, and also where China leads, there is a lot of tendency for other countries to follow sometimes.
And that applies mostly to adoption of technology, though, right? The creation of
Adoption, but the
technology.
creation also. Look, I think, don't get me wrong, Silicon Valley has been an enormous wealth generator for the United States, and we should celebrate that while at the same time criticizing Silicon Valley. And Europe would love to have its own Silicon Valley, but they are trying to become creators of technology as well. And if you look at some areas of artificial intelligence and tech, there are important hubs within Europe as well. And India. I think India has tremendous promise in some of these areas, but it's also at the crosshairs of tremendous danger. If you look at some very good jobs in India, they are in the context of offshore services. Lots of tasks that are offshore to India, where there are skilled workers with some IT knowledge and ability to use the English language written and spoken in an excellent way. But all of those jobs are at the crosshairs of automation with AI.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And that's why I think in many ways the conversation here that even with my book I tried to spark was how do you become creators of technology and not just a talent nation. I think India's future cannot be just as a talent nation, but really has to be as a tech nation where it's developing technology, where it's creating technology, much like Silicon Valley does. And the idea of just being an offshore service provider will not suffice. While it's been great, it has really led to the transformation of India's digital transformation journey over the last 20, 30 years. But it hasn't necessarily meant that we've built very profitable companies or that we've built companies that have serious moats around their business models like some of the big tech firms in the US do.
Well, that is part of the reason why I think, just like India, many other countries are at the danger of being caught unawares about these generative AI developments, because they have not shown the capacity to create the highest value added sectors yet. That's a process, in the same sense that it took 30 years for China to move from cheap toys and the cheapest textile. Right. It's the same for India. It's going to be the same for Indonesia, Pakistan, Turkey. But in the process, generative AI may completely change the international division of labor.
Yeah, and which leads me to the question I want to ask you. So in my book also, I think, and you were alluding to it just now, I talk about you look back at the industrial era, and one of the key things that any economist talks about is the great divergence, right? How those sets of technologies at that time and access to them, early access to them, adoption of them early, leads to that great divergence chart that many of us who've studied economics in the international context have looked at. And what you are suggesting also seems to be alluding to a possible second great divergence.
Absolutely. But I think the biggest divergence will be within countries at this rate. Inequality is increasing, and it has, in some sense, exploded in the United States already, and we may be on the verge of yet another big explosion in inequality. Look, right now, if large language models turn out to be half of what some of their boosters are claiming to be, then those who control them are going to have tremendous power over information and tremendous power, all sorts of economic inputs, data, creativity, information. And that sector may be highly oligopolistic. It may be just Google and Microsoft with the support of OpenAI, or it may be 3 players or 4 players, but for such an important resource, that would be a tremendous concentration of wealth and power.
Absolutely. And the last time we saw such concentration of power, at least one occasion, when we see such concentration of power in history is the pre-World War One era, and you spent a bit of time talking about that in your book. It leads to this set of choices that elites must not control all the sort of metrics of power and wealth, and leads to, one can argue, the socialist movement, leads to lots and lots of socio-political churn, labor movements, and so on and so forth. So now, if we were to look at that and try and draw some insights for today's time, how does this get restructured, right? So if today everything is leading towards a concentration of power, wealth, data, technology, capital, and we are seeing signs of it, and having seen how it was dealt with the last time around, at least 100 years ago, what are some of the key lessons or insights or sort of action items that we can draw for today's time?
Well, look, I mean, there are so many parallels. It's a little bit cheap to draw them out so much, but
no, but please do it.
Inequality was exploding in the Gilded Age that started at the end of the 19th century. It was an era of technological innovations, and the people who were at the forefront of it were also becoming fabulously wealthy and fabulously powerful. Carnegie, Rockefeller. But even more strikingly, what made them so powerful was that they were controlling these new industries that had systemic importance for the economy as a whole. Oil and transport. Those were services and goods on which the rest of the economy depended.
It's moving. That's right. And one can argue even finance, right? Banks.
And
one
even
can
finance,
argue
JP Morgan, and absolutely.
JP Morgan, correct.
And that had become a tremendously concentrated and tremendously powerful industry as well. And that advantage was feeding into more and more inefficiencies in the economy. To make things worse, we had a fairly corrupt politics where Congress people and senators were bought and sold. There were limits on democracy. For example, direct elections of senators had not been introduced yet. Many limits on the tools that the federal government had. There was no Federal Reserve. There was no proper income tax. There was a limited set of instruments for regulation. And media was often in the hands of very rich tycoons as well. So you can say this was the time when it would be very difficult for democracy to work and for these larger-than-life characters to be brought under control. But at the end, the progressive movement, muckrakers, and others from society's heart really managed to do that. And they did that by changing the narrative, laying it bare upon the people that, these very, very wealthy individuals who had become also, media celebrities for their day, were actually abusing their power and influencing politics, suppressing their workers and wages, destroying rivals unfairly. They helped build countervailing powers and new institutions such as the labor movement. And they also led to the adoption of specific policies, including in the financial domain, including into anti-regulations and so on. And in fact, in the book, Simon Johnson and I draw parallels into the current age, turning this into a sort of a recipe for what needs to be done. But on the other hand, I think there are, some may say, well, today we are much more enlightened, we are much more educated, we have much more information at our fingertips, our democracy is more direct and healthy. But actually, I don't think so. I think there is a sense in which things are harder today because tech barons have a much greater lock on our information and narrative than
expression
Rockefeller
of our
ever
views,
did.
correct?
Right, exactly. So today, it's not tanks, it's not jackboots that are the threat against democracy. It is control over information and persuasion power, monopoly over persuasion power. That's what we argue in the book.
And are we looking at more deeper welfare states as a result as well?
I don't know. I think we are at a point of flux. When Simon and I started writing this book, and when I I myself wrote some articles touching upon some of the themes, Donald Trump was the president and the welfare state, such as it was in the United States, was being dismantled in some respects.
Correct.
Even the modicum of healthcare that provided access to previously uninsured people was on the cutting table. Today,
Yeah.
we've had a 100-degree turn, and industrial policy has become the new buzzword. And we have tremendously ambitious new programs, but it remains to be seen. I think we are at another point of flux, and there are many things that, for example, the Biden administration is doing that are bold and ambitious. On the other hand, I think they're doing it without a map. They don't have a conceptual framework of what they're trying to achieve. And the most important things to me, such as control over new technology, the direction of technology, and control of the tech world, I think those are not on their agenda, or they are as add-ons.
And it seems to me that the recent efforts in the US to, things like the IRA, the CHIPS Act, etc., all of these initiatives seem to be more concerned about the divergence between nations, in this case, the US and China, than the divergence within the US.
Yes.
And goes back to the question I was asking about the
exactly.
That's
what I mean without a roadmap in some sense, meaning that I think the Biden administration had some good instincts that technological leadership had to be bolstered in the United States, and they saw this opening, and they may have felt it themselves, but they saw this opening that anti-China feelings are bipartisan in some sense in Congress, and they have put everything in a China-US competition axis or framework. But I don't think that's the right framework for dealing with these issues. If China did not exist, we would still have a problem of Google and Microsoft and Amazon and Facebook having so much power over us.
Yeah, and if you're sitting in, a country other than the US or China today, right, as you are and as I am currently, at least, how do you view this, right? So if you're a country that's a Turkey or an India or a Brazil or a France, how do you view this frame that seems to have developed now for geoeconomics, geopolitical strategy, industrial strategy, which is the US versus China?
Well, I think, first of all, there's some apprehension and lack of complete understanding of the implications of this new rivalry. And the same is true in the United States and China, probably. But also, and I have been to several countries over the last few years talking about these issues. And what I see is most politicians and business leaders are asleep at the wheel. They deal with more immediate concerns, what's going to happen in the next election, what will happen to the inflation rate, or this or that current crisis they have to deal with. But questions of what's going on with artificial intelligence and how this will shape the international division of labor, the balance of power in the world, and control over information and data, those are not questions that any of these politicians are asking and talking about. And in fact, I think, you can say, well, what can they do anyway? So if the Turkish president woke up tomorrow and said, okay, that's my main priority, who will listen to Turkey? They don't even listen to, the US president. So, but, these are common issues. India, Turkey, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, they should come together. There are critical questions that are relevant for the entire emerging economies, and they need to develop a voice in global affairs on the issue of technology.
No, absolutely. And, that was one of the main thrusts of my argument. I tried to write it from a global standpoint. And I said that unlike, there was a great game between Britain and Russia that played out 150 years ago in Central Asia. And while that was a regional game, I argue that now this is a global game, and other countries cannot see this or allow this to be seen as a US-China battle alone, because this has implications for every country. And as a result, each country needs to develop a game plan of its own, an economic, geopolitical, possibly military, but definitely an economic and geopolitical game plan to figure out where in this great tech game are you going to play, and where will your sort of niche or your defensible competitive position lie.
Or even more importantly, how can you avoid being swept involuntarily by these gales?
Absolutely correct. Which brings me to the point that you made about institutions and global governance, right? So you've obviously argued that institutions at a national level are key, right, for determining progress and determining prosperity and growth. At the global level and even at the national level, what kind of changes do you anticipate now institutions need to make? Both the global governance institutions that we've seen, the UN Bretton Woods Order, and also within nations. Or are we comfortable with the kind of institutional structure that at least democracies tend to have built over the last several decades?
I mean, I think there is no doubt that democracy is at a crossroads today. Uh, I have not seen in my lifetime anything approaching the current level of polarization and lack of trust and common purpose in politics in the United States, in the UK, in France. And there is also no doubt in my mind that that's a national problem before being a global problem, and that nations have to fix it nationally first. And then once better functioning democratic institutions are in place, that would be the right vehicle for international cooperation, which is also, of course, crucial for dealing with tech, dealing with capital taxation, dealing with pandemics and international health crises. So we do need global institutions. We do need a global umbrella for creating guardrails. After all, how can you regulate Google or Amazon as a national entity? They have many international functions and they exist across borders. But and the same is even more true of any AI technology that's going to emerge. Data is now no longer Indian data or American data. It's global data. But you cannot do that by saying, okay, we're going to be internationalists. You need to fix democracies at home first and then build on top of those foundations.
Yeah, and you've mentioned, and I want to pick up on this. You've mentioned, I think about six or maybe seven or eight policies for redirecting technology, as you say, right? Because you obviously have a very clear view that technology is not deterministic, again, that we must make the choices that are necessary to redirect technology towards this idea of progress that we were talking about, the one that's broader than technological progress. I think we've covered maybe a few of them. Are there any others you want to talk about? I know we've talked about the
Yeah.
big tech piece, breaking up big tech piece. We've talked a little bit about maybe even tax reforms, etc. Any others you want to highlight?
Well, let me say something briefly. My concern is that we are on a path that is failing to take advantage of all of the opportunities that new technologies bring. And that's partly because we are using these technologies in an anti-human direction. We are prioritizing automation rather than making workers more productive. We are using them for surveillance and data collection in order to control and monitor and sometimes manipulate humans. We are using them for non democratic rather than pro-democratic ways. And part of the promise of AI and digital technologies in general is that I think there is a very fruitful pro-human direction. Generative AI, for example, can be a tool for making workers more autonomous, more responsible, more creative, better informed, better decision makers. They can make democracy work better. People who thought that wikis and social media were going to be pro-democratic tools, of course, they were naive and they turned out to be wrong. But they weren't completely delusional. That promise was there in 2000, and it is even more so today. But it's not this direction that we have chosen. So the first step, Simon and I argue, is to recognize that a pro-human, human complementary direction is feasible and desirable, and change the narrative about what technology should do and who controls technology. We all collectively should control technology. It's not Elon Musk, it's not Sam Altman, it's not Mark Zuckerberg, it's not a battle of titans. It is society's responsibility and society's right to have a say on these matters. That's 50% of the battle. Once we do that, we have really achieved a much more clear-eye framework for the discussion. That's not enough by itself. Then we need to build better institutions, countervailing powers. I hope we don't repeat what we saw 4 months ago, 3 months ago, when finally the US Senate woke up that there is something called generative AI. They decided to have a hearing and they invited the top executives of the top 5 tech giants. What about workers? Hundreds
That's
of
right.
millions of workers in the United States and billions of workers around the world are going to be impacted. What about their voice and their views? No, they don't count. Well, so we changed that by having countervailing powers, better institutions for participatory decision making. And then we should think about specific policies, and we mentioned 7 of them in the book. For example, leveling the playing field in terms of taxes. The US tax code, the British tax code, for example, most other countries, they subsidize capital and they tax labor. That creates an artificial tendency for
automation.
automating work.
That's right.
We have created this ecosystem around digital individualized ads that are highly manipulative, and they doesn't allow alternative business models that are much more participatory to emerge. So we propose digital ad taxes to deal with that. We also think that data is going to become more and more important. And right now, the data of hundreds of millions of people, and especially creative workers, such as artists, journalists, writers, are being expropriated by tech companies. So we need to have data rights, probably collective data rights of some sort. So there are a number of other policy ideas related to this, but we don't claim that any of this is a magic bullet. And in some of them, perhaps we are wrong and others will come up with better ideas. But we want to change the conversation, and we want to take the first step for understanding the need for building new institutions around these topics.
No, absolutely, and I think that's I mean, as urgent conversation that needs to be started publicly and globally, I think, as any other, because as you rightly say, the stakes are high. The future of our societies and the structure of our societies and our economies globally is in many ways at stake. Let me ask you just the last question, and I know we're running out of time, which is at the human level. So often the conversations, when people are now talking about AI, there's obviously high level conversation that people have just about curiosity about the technology, but then there's also this human fear of whether I will become irrelevant or I will become redundant, etc. Right? And it's related to jobs, but it's also deeper in many ways, right? This battle that you were also talking about between machine and human. So my question is, as you think about it, right? Industrial revolution made us evolve as humans. Our values evolved, our capabilities that we needed to have evolved, or in many ways maybe devolved. What's your sense of now in this age of generative AI and technology that we are currently in the midst of? What kind of capabilities are going to be required for humans to adapt and evolve along with the technological evolution that we are seeing?
Well, obviously, at one level, the answer is very simple. We need to develop skills that are complementary to machines rather than substitutable to machines. But I want to add 2 things to that. First of all, the future of technology is uncertain, and it's our choice. It's not like these technologies have a determinate path that they're going to follow. How they develop will determine what those complementary skills are. And I think the real danger, and that's where the human element comes most importantly, the real danger is that companies are going to push these technologies in a direction that increases their control over society, which also involves more information being monopolized in their hands and more automation and less new tasks. And when that happens, that's actually going to leave less room for human complementary actions because more and more is automated. The human is sidelined. That's not a bright future for us. It's not good for business organizations. It's not good for democracy, but it is a path that could be imposed upon us. So therefore, I think the most important human element is actually to take ownership. The democratic step right now that via elections and other means, media, civil society organizations, I think there needs to be a counterweight, a pushback against companies to encourage them to be more pro-human in their directions. And I think that's the most important lesson from my research in the book.
Yeah, and with the clarity that pro-human here does not mean Luddite views of being anti-technology.
Absolutely not. Ludditism is like you try to stop the river. No, I don't think what we need to do is to stop the river, but dams are most useful when they redirect the river in a better pasture so that we can make better use of it. We don't want to create floods. We want to create the right type of energy to fuel our next developments.
That's right. And if I may add, the values here that will be at stake, right? So, I mean, when certain technologies get developed in, let's say, the US, where labor might be, let's say, short, right? And where automation might have a certain value, compared to a country like India, where in a way you have the reverse. You have excess of labor, and you're looking for more structured and gainful employment. The technological choices that countries like India have to make are going to inherently be very different than the choices.
Well, that's why India and
Israel
Turkey and
might take
Indonesia
off.
and Mexico need to be at the table as well. I think the choices are very, very important, and they are our choices. This is a really critical point, Pierre, in our history for that reason.
Absolutely. I know we've run out of time, but thank you so much.
Thank you. This was my true pleasure.
Two quick questions, right? And every podcast with two quick questions. One is a book that you would recommend other than yours and mine for people who are interested in these issues. And second is another guest for the podcast that you think would be great to have.
Well, let me actually recommend a really interesting book that I read recently called, after I finished this book, called God, Human, Animal, Machine by Megan O'Glibbon, about where ideas about autonomous machines come from and how they merge with religious ideas. It's actually a very entertaining and thought-provoking book. I also recommend Michael Sandel's Tyranny of Merit, about how we have sort of created the wrong sort of perceptions in our society about who is successful and how that success is achieved. And I think Michael Sandel would be an excellent guest if you haven't had him on the program. James Robinson would be another guest I would recommend. I think and I think on questions of technology and thinking about how the tech sector works, I think another person who would be great is Rana Farquhar, who is a journalist at FT and has written two wonderful books on these topics.
Yeah, I read a book, and I love Michael Sandel's Tyranny of Merit. It made me really question so many assumptions that one didn't even realize one had in their mind. Yeah, no, so absolutely.
Wonderful. So thanks for this conversation. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Professor Acemoglu, and look forward to seeing you in India at some point soon. It's not that far.
Thank you very much. Oh, that's not that far. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Take care now.